Good morning, everyone. I see we've got a reasonably small group today. Can I get a sense, how many people of you in the audience would consider yourselves technical and how many would consider yourselves managerial? How many technical people do I have in the room? Okay, good. So that makes it a little easier for me. Today I'm giving a talk about implementing secure DevOps assessment for highly regulated environments. I'm going to start with a little background. Most of you probably know what DevOps is, but I'm going to do a little bit of talk about that, and then go through, what is HRE and why is it different? Some of the problems that you could run into working in a highly regulated environment, and so on. So we're the Software Engineering Institute. As a federally funded research and development center, we research and practice in software development, acquisition, and maintenance practices. We have assisted and continue to assist numerous government organizations in modernizing their software development practices in the spirit of DevOps principles. Application security is one of our principal quality attributes, so that aligns really well with the way the government builds software today. So I want to start with a definition of DevOps for you. DevOps is a set of principles and practices emphasizing collaboration and communication between software development teams and IT operations staff, along with acquisition, suppliers, and other stakeholders in the life cycle of a software system. So you can break that up into what do they do. So there's dev and there's ops. So dev is agile methodologies, new technologies. You kind of got your typical development environments trying to do modern agile stuff. And you've got operations that are tasked with maintaining servers and infrastructure, maintaining high reliability, and keeping their systems secure. So the desires of these two groups are kind of at odds with each other, right? You've got the developers, the development groups that want to deliver new software features, and they want to do it quickly. Whereas ops wants to maintain the stability of the systems that they maintain, and which means good uptime numbers, right? So those are kind of at odds with each other, and that's kind of what DevOps is about, really, is figuring out how to make them not at odds with each other, make them work well together. So we outline the four fundamental principles of DevOps: collaboration, infrastructure as code, automation, and monitoring. So collaboration means, between project teams and the various roles on those teams. Infrastructure as code is making sure that all of your assets, whether they're scripts or whatever your product is, are versioned and available to everyone, shared across your organization. Automation, this is what people think of typically when they think of DevOps: deployment, testing, provisioning, and any manual process that makes sense to automate. Monitoring, any metric in the development or operational space that can inform priorities, direction, and policy. There's a whole list of metrics. We'll get into that a little later. You'd have to think about some of the challenges that organizations have in adopting DevOps, and from my perspective, it normally comes down to making people work together, getting people to work together, right? You have to ask yourself, do your devs know exactly what actual production systems look like? Because in a lot of cases, they don't actually have access to those systems. Does ops know how development packages are built? Are they built the same way every time? Can your dev and ops collaborate on server configuration and apply it automatically to both development and production environments? Do business analysts know the cost of feature addition or modification? Maybe they don't. Project managers can project managers measure project status at any point in time? And this is a big one for management usually, right? They want to know where the projects are at, how close we are to deployment, whether we're having problems and whatnot. So they need a way to be able to have that level of transparency while work is getting done. Can the customer measure project status at any point in time? So same thing with the project managers. Customers need that same level of information usually. Enabling effective collaboration. So I tend to think that this is the main thing that we run into. You run into environments that want to do DevOps, but they don't know how. And when you really dig in, you find out that a lot of the issues that they run into are not technology problems. They are trying to figure out how to get people to work together across teams that are not used to working together, teams that have different responsibilities, teams that don't understand why they have to work together. And these are your silos, right? Your typical. It's a pretty typical organization, honestly, that you see these sorts of issues. So the big question, how can I implement secure DevOps process and platform in my team or directorate or project or organization? How do we assess the current state? Where are the productivity bottlenecks? Whom to train and on what? What and how to measure, and how do we monitor that? So current state of the practice, we use surveys, right? We talk to individuals, we talk to teams. We use that information to guide us in our research on how to measure things and make things better for people. We perform maturity assessments, and we use tools and collaborate with companies who are doing this type of work. So highly regulated environments. So if you want to do DevOps in an environment such as a highly regulated one, whether that's something like DoD or healthcare or finance, they have some interesting challenges that have to be considered if you're looking at the normal DevOps approach. Some of these environments they don't have network connectivity. You have individuals working in isolation from each other. They have strong physical security requirements. Their duties don't allow them to collaborate with each other. And then you can even have classification, right? So they have an inability to speak or share artifacts between each other because they don't have a need to know or the right clearance. They can have different levels of security and risk management, limitations on what they can do as far as deployment. The requirement for auditing is different in every environment too. So, these are some of the things that make a highly regulated environment different, substantially different in some cases from a typical commercial business. So if we look at that, you have your traditional DevOps cycle, which is a kind of a loop, right? You make a plan, you do some development, you build, you test, and then you deploy. Well, when you're working with HRE, the point at which you deploy typically falls down, right? You can't do deployment in the same way. If you could, this would be real easy, right? But you can't, deployment, what does that mean, right? If you have an air-gapped network to automatically deploy something, it's probably not happening. So you have to figure out ways to make these different environments work with HRE. So how can we do an assessment in these types of environments and engage them in secure DevOps processes? Some common pitfalls. So in preparing for this talk, where's my cursor? Do I have a cursor? No cursor. Which way am I? Am I on this side? This side. There we go. So I was talking to a colleague of mine. His name's Doug Reynolds, in preparing for this talk. And I realized that the thing he was working on was something that was very much applicable to the types of problems that we have to deal with typically in a technical manner when working in highly regulated environments. So I asked him to kind of give me a little story on what that looked like and what type of things he was doing. So he says, Dave, you asked me for a paragraph describing Python installations without connectivity. Have any of you ever tried to do this? Install something, Python, and it has to work in an environment where you cannot connect to the internet. If you haven't, it's a really fascinating experience. Python just assumes that the internet is there, right? And he says, for example, Python code is commonly deployed using virtual env and pip. Virtual env creates a sandbox for specific application dependencies, and pip installs the packages and their dependencies. These tools were designed to reach out to the Python packaging site, pypy.python.org, to download the dependencies. When they're connected to the internet, these tools function mostly without issue. It is possible that the tools can function without connectivity. However, it can be frustrating to perform the initial offline configuration. Virtual env requires the pip setup tools and wheel group packages. It will reach out to PyPy for those packages. Even if you point it to a local directory that you've set up ahead of time that has those packages, it will still phone home unless you use the no download parameter. And it doesn't have an option to change the PyPy URL. You can't change it. Pip allows you to override the PyPy URL. However, instead of checking the local mirror for updates to itself, it will phone home to check for updates. This functionality can be disabled with the disable pip version check, but it would be nice if pip would check the local mirror for updates. After spending an hour or two on configuration, you start to wonder if it would make more sense to change the local DNS to redirect pypy.python.org to a local IP address. However, you would have to deal with installing fake TLS certificates on your client machines. Offline installation of packages is a problem that can be solved. The solution can vary depending on the environment and requires planning to implement an offline package management solution. When it comes to solving these issues, open source software is your friend. So that is kind of like one example of the types of things that people typically run into when they're looking to actually do DevOps in an environment where they just can't get access, right? And it's a pretty common problem that we deal with. A number of things can go wrong. There's technical problems, and then there's organizational culture, right? The organizational culture problems are where you sort of run into some of the characterizations of DevOps, right? It's a fad. It's only about tooling and automation. I can just buy a product for that and we'll have DevOps. It's only about Dev and Ops, so none of the other groups in our organization need to be concerned with it. So basically, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we plan an assessment for an environment like this. We start by interviewing functional leads from the key areas related to application development. We get, after we have our interviews, we validate some of the things that they say us through, they tell us through observation of their work and following what their process actually looks like. We get demonstrations of any software tools used for automation that they currently have for software development and deployment. We try to understand their perspective on, how they've seen their development environment change over time and how they interact with their security team. We consider some of their legal and risk management that they have to deal with. So if you're going to do an assessment in a highly regulated environment, you start with a plan, right? You get everyone to agree on the definitions of what DevOps and DevSecOps are. And you've identified your stakeholders. You perform your interviews. Then you take a look at the tooling they have, and you see what type of metrics they're collecting, and establish that they actually are getting the measurements that they need from what they think they're doing. Gap areas, you have to identify the places where you believe that their process is lacking, something that would help them get the process in place that they actually want. And then you kind of work with them to figure out the right project to try it on, right? So you're not just going to take what you've given them as a plan and just deploy it across the entire organization. So they need a team, right? An environment, a set of people who are engaged in this, but not everybody, right? So we would start by scheduling interviews, conducting anonymous surveys sometimes. We analyze the results of those surveys, provide feedback, and then we brief the executive team. So this is kind of like the slide that just, this is what people think of when they think of the role of developers. They're concerned with performance and updates, their functional requirements that they have to deliver, programming, testing, code review, user interfaces. And then there's, your IT operations that is concerned with scalability, infrastructure maintenance, networks, deployments, and in some sense updating as well, some overlap there. But there's also a lot of other roles that play into this process. Your quality assurance teams, they're creating your technical documentation, they're performing release reviews, they're writing user documentation, in addition to the normal testing and user interface validation that they do. Your business analyst, that's usually another team. They're concerned with the business constraints and legal issues and marketing needs, user requirements for meeting all of these issues, and of course, budget and how long it's going to take to deliver these. Information security, they're interested in monitoring, data privacy, incident response, intrusion detection, and just general overall security, in addition to some overlapping concerns with developers and business side of the house. So the point of this is, this is the large picture of 10,000 foot picture, if you will, of everyone and all of their concerns that are involved in your DevOps process that you have to engage and make sure that everyone is getting what they need in order to be effective. So your business analyst or your program manager, they're concerned with your requirements development, acquisition and contracting process, risk management process, compliance, project planning and tracking. And you have to take into consideration all of these different concerns, make sure that you understand the environment really well to get these people to work together. You have to understand their pain points, right? Whether they're business developers or software developers or quality assurance. Everyone you talk to kind of has like a thing that bothers them, right? Usually about their current process or their current environment, what they can or can't do. And you have to work through that with them to understand what that is. Because ultimately, the solution is going to require, not just the automation and the tools, but when you're working in an environment like a highly regulated one, the people problems become amplified, right? Because a lot of the processes around deploying and getting things into production environment, they require humans to actually do them, right? There's just no way around it, right? So whether it's compliance or accreditation in some environments, every one of these teams has things that they are concerned about. So of course there's the operations team. So they have they're like we talked about earlier. They're concerned with making sure that the software is managed properly, that they've got the right licensing in place, and that they're not breaking any laws by running the software, and then of course making sure that it stays online. Your security teams often work pretty closely with your operations teams because they need to monitor the running system and make sure that the latest patches are being applied, and that there's that they're getting the right information they need to monitor that environment. So, perspective from the technology stack. What does this mean? This means, the language and tools that you use, the tools that your IT department uses, how the enterprise supports the software that they use, whether they do that in-house or whether they rely on service contracts with organizations that they purchase software from. You have legacy systems that come into play, right? It's not just about the new systems that you're developing and running. There's things that have been there that usually predate most of the people that are now in the organization, and nobody knows how to use them, or they just know that they're critical and that they can't get rid of them. So metrics and measurements. You have your normal software metrics. Is it reliable, right? Is it secure? Does it perform well? Does it scale? Some people today have scalability needs that can vary over time, right? Their user base changes depending on what's going on, from a few users to a few 100,000, right? So software needs to scale well. That's an important one. So towards the end of the assessment, we would typically work with the stakeholders to develop a rollout plan. I mean, that, like we said earlier, that involves choosing the right project and choosing the right group of people to be involved in that, and figure out how to minimize the risks to their business, basically, while they're testing their new process. So after the assessment's been performed, sharing all of this information back out to the team, and coming up with the cohesive process is really important for us to do in performing the assessment, because if we don't do that, we haven't really delivered what they've asked us for. So as I said earlier, it's really a people-driven process. You have to engage all of your stakeholders. So your process, you have to establish a process to enable people to succeed in using the platform that is developed to secure the application. It requires constant communication and visibility to everyone who's involved in the process. You want to ensure that the tasks are testable and repeatable. You're trying to free up your people resources to do the more challenging and creative work. And ultimately, one of the main things that comes up in highly regulated environments is they're trying to reduce the amount of time that it actually takes to get something deployed and usable by your customers. So the improvements that you're trying to make in a lot of cases are very tangible. You're trying to accelerate the amount of time, reduce the amount of time between developers who have created a new feature and getting it into your users' hands, right? So, whether the challenges are due to accreditation or the inability to automatically shift things around because of network constraints. The goal of all of these things that you're trying to break down the problems and find solutions to them is in a lot of cases just to make things go faster. Where people use process to build secure software, you're going to need an automated environment for creating and provisioning resources. You're going to need automated infrastructure for testing, and parity between development, QA, staging, and production environments. So you really ideally want everything to be the same, right, across your different phases of development, whether it's just initial development or it's moved on to QA, it's moving into a test and production environment. You want the environments to be as similar as you can, but that's one of the challenges of highly regulated environments is when you start moving things to production, a lot of times the production environment isn't something that can be easily replicated. So you have to figure out ways to get the systems as close as possible. And if actually having an environment like the production environment isn't possible, then it really becomes imperative for everyone from development and QA and production to have a solid understanding of what the production environment looks like and what the development and testing environments look like if you're on production, so that they can make things as similar as possible. Which of course means you need collaboration, right? So once the assessment's been performed, we revisit the model here, And instead of this situation where we have a production environment where we can't deploy to it, we have an additional environment that is as similar as we can get it to the production environment that we deploy to and observe before it then gets deployed to the production environment, whatever that process involves. In some cases, it's copying software to a CD, moving it over. Adding in security, right? This is one scenario for adding in security is the request comes in to push something into a production environment, and then there is a decision process involved by your security team. Is this something that we can put into the environment, or do we need to really look at this closely before it goes in? And there's different strategies. The different organizations will employ policies for how to make that happen. But again, if you have engaged the security team ahead of time, you've given them the heads up. These changes are coming. This is what they are. It gives them a little look ahead, a way to think about these changes before they actually end up in their queue, right, to make a decision on them. So we have some samples of some DevOps environments that we have created. They're available. These links will be up in the slide deck and available when we get the deck to you all. You can always visit our blog if you want more information about this and other DevOps topics.